Hello everyone, very good morning. Welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep. Welcome to our daily Hindu analysis. So let's take a look at the topics we're going to discuss today. We have three important articles from page number 8 and 12. These topics cover Indian polity, international relations, and science and technology. We shall discuss all the three articles in complete detail, both for prelims and mains. And after that, we'll take a look at four smaller articles from a prelims point of view. So just stay with me for the next 1 hour. I'll try to cover all these articles comprehensively so that you don't have to go back and read the newspaper. But before we begin, don't forget to support us by pressing the like button, share your comments, and do subscribe to our channel. And also, as soon as the session ends, directly head to our Telegram channel because we shall have a quiz on these topics so that you can revise these topics as well. So let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at an important column from page number 8 of the Delhi edition of The Hindu. In this column, the writer, who is a former deputy CAG, he talks about the independence of constitutional authorities in India and their role in a constitutional democracy. The writer, with his experience as a deputy CAG, is highlighting the role of constitutional authorities like the CAG or the Comptroller and Auditor General of India and the important role they play in holding the executive accountable. If constitutional bodies like CAG, Election Commission, the UPSC, the judiciary, and other such important constitutional authorities, if they have to function in a free and fair manner, if they have to function independently, without any influence from the executive, without coming under any pressure from vested interests, then the only guarantee for these institutions is a constitutional guarantee. With regard to the establishment of these institutions, the appointment of the chairpersons of these institutions, the removal process, their emoluments, the funds for the functioning of these constitutional bodies, if they are kept independent from the executive, that is when you can guarantee the independence of these key constitutional authorities. So here the writer is examining this topic in complete detail. He is not just focused on the CAG, he is looking at all the constitutional bodies and he examines the appointment process and how these institutions can be made more independent from the influences of the executive. But if you look at the context in which the writer is arguing, it is based on two recent observations and important judgments by the Supreme Court. Recently, the Supreme Court of India has stressed upon the independence and autonomy of important constitutional authorities. For example, in the Shiv Sena party symbol case, where there was a split in the party and the role of the governor was under question, the Supreme Court was highly critical of the role of the governor in Maharashtra's state politics. The Supreme Court observed that of late governors are increasingly getting involved in state politics. And don't forget, the office of the governor is a constitutional office. There are few restrictions on what the governor can and cannot do. And in many instances, the governor often becomes the agent of the center. The governor would be seen as biased towards the ruling party at the center, favoring the ruling party at the center to exert political influence at the state level, to destabilize state governments and sometimes even topple state governments. So the role of governor has often come under criticism from many, many years. There are various commissions as well which have looked into the functioning of the governor, and the Supreme Court in the S.R. Bommai case had indeed placed few restrictions on the office of the governor. The Supreme Court has repeatedly spoken about the appointment process of the governor and the exact role of the governor as well. So in the recent case involving Shiv Sena and Maharashtra state politics, the role of governor was heavily criticized by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was of the opinion that governor's office is no longer independent. The governor is not fulfilling the constitutional mandate, rather acting as an agent of the center, working for the interests of the ruling party at the center. Another important case was with regard to the appointment process for Election Commission of India. Recently, the Supreme Court delivered a historic judgment in the interest of protecting the independence of the Election Commission. Prior to this judgment, the Chief Election Commissioner and the election commissioners, they would be appointed by the President based on the recommendations of the Council of Ministers headed by the Prime Minister. Essentially, the government had complete control over the appointment process to the Election Commission. Recently, the Supreme Court has taken away this discretion of the government and has provided for a high-powered committee to provide for the appointment of Chief Election Commissioner and the election commissioners. In March 2023, the Supreme Court passed this historic judgment, according to which a high-powered committee, including the Prime Minister of India, the Leader of Opposition in the Lok Sabha, and the Chief Justice of India, will together recommend the names for appointment for Chief Election Commissioner and election commissioners so that the President can appoint these key constitutional authorities. So thus, the role of the executive has been curbed when it comes to appointments with regard to Election Commission of India. The Supreme Court has passed this judgment in order to protect the independence of the institution. So in this context, the writer is further diving deep into this topic and looking at the need for independence of our constitutional authorities. Now, if you look at the Indian Constitution, there are several constitutional authorities. For example, we have the Public Service Commissions, the Union and State Public Service Commissions, established under Article 315. You have the CAG, the Comptroller and Auditor General of India, who plays a critical role in auditing the finances of the state under Article 148. You have the Election Commission under Article 324. The Finance Commission, which plays a key role in center-state finance relations. We discussed this topic recently as well, which has been provided under Article 280. And we have the National Commission for Scheduled Castes, Scheduled Tribes and Backward Classes under Article 338, 338A and 338B. These are some of the important constitutional authorities, and it's extremely crucial that these institutions function in an independent manner. Because these constitutional bodies, they act as a system of checks and balances against any misuse of power, against any abuse of power by the executive, by the elected government. One of the foundational principles of a democracy is the doctrine of separation of powers. If you look at the three pillars of democracy, the executive, legislature, and the judiciary, the powers have been clearly drawn out so that the judiciary, executive, and legislature have their own jurisdiction and they exercise a system of checks and balances over each other. The legislature plays a role in keeping the executive under check. The legislature has the powers to overrule the judiciary by bringing out laws and amendments. Judiciary plays a role in keeping the legislature and the executive under check, right? Similarly, constitutional bodies have their defined role under the Constitution. They play a critical role in the constitutional scheme of things, and especially when it comes to keeping the government under check, preventing the abuse and misuse of power, these authorities play a critical role. So they can function efficiently as outlined under the Indian Constitution, as envisioned by our constitution makers, only when these institutions enjoy true autonomy, constitutional autonomy. But every now and then, there are concerns and allegations regarding executives' interference in the functioning of these institutions. There have been questions regarding the independence of the CAG, as the government has almost discretionary powers in the appointment of the CAG. There have been allegations of autonomy of the Election Commission being compromised by the government. There have been concerns about the way in which the National Commission on SCs, STs have been functioning, right? Even with UPSC, even though UPSC is a constitutional body, plays a critical role in conducting the public service examinations, there are always concerns regarding how autonomous, how independent these institutions really are. It's in this context that the writer takes us through the appointment process. He takes a look at the appointment process to these constitutional bodies and tries to draw out a distinction between some of the critical constitutional authorities. It's very important to ensure the independence and autonomy of these institutions because, as I said, they play a very, very important role in curbing the powers of the executive, in keeping the executive under check. But the fear is always that the executive might interfere by using its powers to appoint these constitutional authorities, the executive might interfere, it might appoint those officers who might be biased towards the ruling party or who might have a vested interest in helping the executive or in acting in favor of the executive. So these concerns can be addressed only when the discretion in appointment process can be taken away. The Constitution actually defines the appointment process of these constitutional authorities. Even for judges to the judiciary, the higher judiciary, the appointment process is laid down. Appointment of election commissioners, their removal, right, and the CAG and the Finance Commission, as well as the Election Commission, they've all been laid out and they draw their powers from the Constitution. But the eventual independence of these authorities and institutions, it all lies in the hands of the executive. Many of these institutions, eventually, they come under the powers of the executive, they come under the influence of the executive in some way or the other. So this vested interest is what raises concerns with regard to the independent functioning of these bodies. Now, if you look at the Indian Constitution, if you carefully go through the appointment process which has been laid out, with regard to some of the constitutional institutions and offices, like the Office of the Prime Minister, the Attorney General for India, the Chairman and members of Finance Commission, the Chairman and members of Public Service Commissions, and Special Officer for Linguistic Minorities under Article 350B. With regard to appointing these authorities and these offices, the Constitution says that they shall be appointed by the President. That is the key word here. This is a key operative word which has been used by our Constitution makers. Under Article 324, which deals with Election Commission of India, it says President will appoint the Chief Election Commissioner and Election Commissioners, subject to any law made by the Parliament. Now, what does it essentially mean? It essentially means that here the President is largely bound by the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. These are not discretionary powers of the President. Now, the leader of the single largest party will have to be appointed as the PM by the President. The President can't choose someone else. Attorney General, as recommended by the Council of Ministers, has to be appointed by the President. Previously, with regard to Election Commission as well, before the Supreme Court's judgment, again as recommended by the Council of Ministers, headed by the PM, President had to appoint the Chief Election Commissioner and Election Commissioners. So these are some of the constitutional bodies where the President has no discretion, where the government essentially controls the appointment process. But however, there are few constitutional offices which have been set apart by our Constitution makers. This includes the higher judiciary, the Supreme Court and the High Court, the CAG and the Governor. According to the writer, these three constitutional bodies have been set apart in the appointment process. If you carefully go through the constitutional provisions, you'll be able to see this. Because when it comes to the appointment of these key institutions, the Constitution says that they shall be appointed by the President by warrant under his hand and seal. Similar words have been used under Article 338, 338A and 338B, which was recently added into the Constitution through the 102nd Constitutional Amendment Act, which gave constitutional status to the National Commission on Backward Classes. With regard to appointments to these institutions, the wording used is slightly different. And there is a deeper meaning behind this. That is exactly what the writer is examining. The writer is saying that not all constitutional bodies are the same. There are few constitutional authorities which are more critical for the healthy functioning of our democracy to keep the executive under check. And hence the Constitution makers, they had the foresight, they had the vision to ensure that these critical institutions like the judiciary, the governor's office, CAG and the others are given a higher degree of independence and autonomy. This can be guaranteed only by protecting them from the undue influences of the executive. If all the appointment powers are directly in the hands of the executive, that is when these institutions might be compromised. But if they are made more independent in their appointment process, in their removal process, they can function in a free and fair manner with the fear of being threatened by the government. That is what truly makes these institutions more autonomous and independent. But if you look at Article 75 and as well as various Supreme Court rulings have made it very clear that the president is largely bound by the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. Yes, because the president is a nominal authority, a nominal executive, and the president is bound by the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers headed by the PM. This was made very clear by the Supreme Court as well in the N. Gopal Swamy case. But however, according to the writer, if you look at the constitution makers, the founding fathers of India, if you look at the debates that took place in the Constituent Assembly, if you look at the wordings which have been used carefully in the Constitution, there is a certain distinction which has been made in the appointment process to these constitutional bodies. When we spoke about the appointment of specific institutions, such as the Supreme Court, High Court, the CAG, and the Office of the Governor, there is a distinct power which has been provided to the President. The President appoints these authorities under his warrant and seal. Whereas when it comes to, let's say, UPSC or the Advocate Attorney General, the Attorney General for India or the Advocate General at the state level, when it comes to Finance Commission, right? Here the President will appoint or shall appoint the names recommended by the Council of Ministers. So there is a certain distinction that you see here in the wordings which have been used. So to understand this further, if you look at the Constitution Assembly debates, it becomes very evident that the Constitution framers, they favored more independence, more autonomy for some of these institutions. While talking about the appointment process to the CAG, in the Constituent Assembly debates, it was made very clear that the CAG is a critical institution, as the CAG audits the finances of the state, plays a critical role in ensuring that the state does not misuse its financial powers. So when it came to the appointment process of the CAG, several amendments were introduced in the Constituent Assembly to make it more independent. Here clearly the wording used is the President shall appoint by warrant under his hand and seal. The wording is same which is used with regard to appointment of judges as well, with regard to the governor as well. These three offices have been set aside, according to the writer, by our constitution makers. So we would be doing a disservice, the government would be doing a disservice to the nation if this distinction is not recognized, if this independence autonomy, which was favored for these institutions by our constitution makers, is not upheld. The Supreme Court has managed to shield itself, along with the High Courts, through its collegium system of appointments. The writer says, the higher judiciary has made itself insulated from any unnecessary executive interference by granting itself that autonomy in the appointment process through the collegium system. Yes, the collegium system has a lot of criticism. It's known for its opaqueness. It's a system of judges appointing themselves. Of course, the criticism is on one side. But however, the fact is, the collegium system does help the judiciary to protect its independence when it comes to the appointment process from any unnecessary interference from the executive. The governor's office has been compromised. The governor's office has become a political appointment. It's been like this since many, many years, and the governor's office has not been truly independent. But the writer says the CAG, being a critical institution, should be provided this degree of autonomy as well. Recently, thanks to the intervention of the Supreme Court, the Election Commission also has been provided with this autonomy and independence. Previously, Election Commission, as far as appointments were concerned, was under the influence of the Government of India, right? The Council of Ministers would recommend the names of the Chief Election Commissioner and the Election Commissioners to the President, and the President was bound to appoint them. But now the Supreme Court, which has intervened, has reset this process, and it has created a high-powered committee headed by the Prime Minister, the Chief Justice of India, and the Leader of Opposition in the Lok Sabha to take a call on the appointment of Chief Election Commissioner and Election Commissioners. Through this ruling, Election Commission also has been provided with its independence, constitutional independence. So now the remaining institution here is the CAG, the Comptroller Auditor General of India, right? The powers of the CAG, the role of the CAG is clearly defined from Article 148 to 151. And if you look at the appointment process, here the wording used is that the President shall appoint the CAG under his warrant and seal, which makes it clear that the Constituent Assembly wanted more powers to be given to the CAG CAG to be made more independent from any excessive influence, interference from the executive. That is why the writer is suggesting that the appointment process of the CAG should be changed. As of now, the CAG is appointed by the President based on the recommendations of the Council of Ministers. Essentially, the government has greater control, almost complete control over the appointment of the CAG. The President is bound to appoint because of Article 75, which binds the President to the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers. So here the writer is suggesting, in order to make the CAG more independent and autonomous, he's suggesting that there should be a committee, there should be an appointment committee, including the Speaker of the Lok Sabha, the Chief Justice of India, and the Chairman of PAC, the Public Accounts Committee of the Parliament, who would shortlist a set of names. And these names should be forwarded to the President by the Council of Ministers, and President will choose one of them to make the final selection and appoint them as the CAG as per provisions of Article 148. So according to the writer, this will protect the independence, autonomy of the CAG, as CAG is critical for ensuring the integrity of public finances. As the CAG audits the finances of the government, it's very essential to protect its independence and autonomy. The constitution makers, during Constitution Assembly debates, had clearly pointed this out, and according to the writer, this is the reason why the wording is different, which has been used in the Constitution when it comes to the appointment of the CAG. It's on line with the appointment of judges to the higher judiciary. It's on line with the office of the governor. Now, judiciary has its own appointment process through the collegium system. Election Commission also has got its independence due to the recent Supreme Court judgment. Of course, governor's office has been compromised, but the writer is saying at least the CAG's independence should be protected by taking the discretionary powers out of the government, reducing the role of the government in the appointment of the CAG. So CAG can function freely, without fear, without any favor, and play a critical role in acting as a system of checks and balance against the executive. So that is the core argument being made by the writer here with regard to independence of our constitutional authorities. All right. Now, we shall move on to the second article from page number 8, from the editorial page. We have an important article related to the current situation in Myanmar. Myanmar is a critical neighbor of India. It's a Southeast Asian country which shares direct land and maritime borders with India. If you observe the map here, India's northeastern states such as Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Manipur and Mizoram, they share a long boundary with Myanmar, around 1,600 kilometers plus. Myanmar itself is a Southeast Asian country, and we even share a maritime border over here with Myanmar. Myanmar has always been very critical for India, especially with regard to the security situation in the northeast of India. As you know, northeast of India has been very badly affected by northeast insurgency, which has raged from 1950s till date. Throughout India's independent history, northeast region has been affected by insurgency. Insurgency was at its peak in 1960s, 1970s and 1980s. Even though the scale of violence has gone down, the security threat remains over here. Plus, there is the risk of organized crime and other border security threats which emanates from Myanmar. Because Myanmar is part of this Golden Triangle region that includes Myanmar, Thailand and Laos, which is seen as a hub of drug production and other organized criminal activities, including arms trafficking, money laundering, etc. These criminal activities are linked with terror financing, and this directly spills over into India as well. Northeast insurgents have easily accessed weapons and drugs from Myanmar and the Golden Triangle region. Since many northeastern tribes are linked with indigenous communities in Myanmar, they even get cross-border support very easily. Insurgents like Nagas, for example, Mizo insurgents, they've easily got cross-border support from native groups in Myanmar. And along with them, hostile countries such as China and Pakistan via Bangladesh, they have destabilized India by using Myanmar as a base to launch their covert proxy war against India by backing and sponsoring northeast insurgent outfits. So there are many security threats for India that emanate from this critical border, and Myanmar becomes a very important country for India. Also, Myanmar is blessed with great resources, and India, being very close to Myanmar, is obviously interested in exploiting the resources of Myanmar, and we have also made a lot of big investments in Myanmar. For example, India has built the strategic Sitwe port, which you can see here in the map, that's located right next to the Kyokfu port that China has built in Myanmar as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. It's part of the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. India also has parallel investments where India has built the strategic Sitwe port, and we even have an important connectivity project called the Kaladan Multimodal Transit Transport Corridor project, through which India is connecting with Myanmar and creating alternate routes to link with northeast of India. So Myanmar is extremely crucial for India, but the problem is the country has seen a lot of destabilization over the decades. As of now, Myanmar is going through a major crisis. This Buddhist majority nation is going through a major crisis, a political crisis, where large-scale human rights violations are being reported. Since 2021, Myanmar has been placed under military rule, and especially in the last 1 year, Myanmar's military junta has started using excessive force against the opposition leaders and the civilians who are protesting for democracy, and hundreds of people are being killed and slaughtered by Myanmar's military. Frequent airstrikes have been carried out where Myanmar has used disproportionate force against civilians. Now this topic is back in news, back in question, and Hindu has carried an article over here because just a couple of days ago, Myanmar carried out a devastating airstrike against an opposition camp where opposition outfits were holding an event where fighter jets dropped targeted missiles and helicopters were used to target the civilians and the opposition leaders, and more than 100 civilians were killed by Myanmar's military junta. This represents the deteriorating human rights situation in Myanmar and is of great concern for India. As you understood, Myanmar is crucial for security and stability in the northeast. Myanmar is very critical for our Act East policy as well, through which we are focusing on Southeast Asian and East Asian countries. If you look at the map again, Myanmar is like a bridge connecting India with Southeast Asia. So our Act East policy, which is an upgraded version of the Look East policy, it starts from Myanmar. Myanmar is the gateway for India to look at Southeast Asian countries. So you can't have such an important neighbor being destabilized where large-scale human rights violations are taking place. And this is not new. Myanmar has gone through this since 1960s. Now let me briefly take you through the history of Myanmar, the political history. Myanmar, previously known as Burma, was a British colony, just like India. Eventually, Burma gained independence in the year 1948 under the leadership of Aung San, the legendary leader of Myanmar or Burma. And currently his daughter, Aung San Suu Kyi, is a very popular politician, a Nobel Peace Laureate from Myanmar. So Aung San Suu Kyi's father, Aung San, is seen as the founding father of Myanmar, fought for Myanmar's independence from British rule, and eventually became an independent country in 1948. But post-independence, Myanmar faced a number of troubles and challenges. Just like the northeast of India, Myanmar is also a multi-ethnic region where you have many native tribes, indigenous communities. For example, you have the Chins, you have the Kachins. So there are many such native ethnic groups, including the Nagas. Some sub-clans of Nagas are also present. There are multiple native indigenous communities here, and they've often had rivalries with each other. There has been a lot of inter-ethnic conflicts. So from the beginning, Myanmar started witnessing internal divides within its society. And Myanmar being a Buddhist majority state, some of the radical Buddhists would even go to target and discriminate against religious minorities like the Rohingyas, which has destabilized the Rakhine region of Myanmar. The targeted discrimination against Rohingya Muslims by radical Buddhists of Myanmar began from 1960s itself. So this gradual destabilization of Myanmar society, its weak economy, weak political system, gave the military an opportunity to topple the Myanmar government in 1962. And Myanmar's military carried out a military coup through which it captured political power. Using the problems of Myanmar as an excuse, the social, political and economic problems as an excuse, the government was thrown out by the military, a military coup was staged, and the military junta came to power. The military leaders took over the country. So since 1962, for most of the period till now, for more than 60 years, Myanmar has largely been under military dictatorship. In 1980s, there was a rise of a human rights pro-democracy movement led by Aung San Suu Kyi, the daughter of Aung San. Aung San Suu Kyi would come back to Myanmar in 1980s and she would lead a pro-democracy movement which led to massive protests in the country. But Myanmar's military junta would crush the protests with force. Large-scale human rights violations were committed back then as well, and Aung San Suu Kyi was arrested for her leadership role in leading the pro-democracy protests. This brought Myanmar under international pressure, the large-scale human rights violations, and Western countries started putting pressure on the military junta of Myanmar. This forced the military to concede and conduct elections in 1990. These elections were convincingly won by the National League for Democracy, which is headed by Aung San Suu Kyi. It was a clear vote by the people towards pro-democratic parties. But the military, which feared losing power and control, nullified the election results and didn't allow democracy to take root and continued the military dictatorship. Aung San Suu Kyi would be placed under house arrest for years together, and democracy was essentially erased and wiped out in the country during this period. So as the military junta consolidated its power and crushed the pro-democracy movement, Western countries retaliated by imposing crippling economic sanctions against Myanmar's military junta. Western countries cut off their ties with Myanmar and they placed crippling sanctions against Myanmar's military leaders and important institutions of Myanmar. Over here, it's very interesting to observe India's position. Despite all these atrocities happening in our neighboring country, India took a very different approach and a very unique stand. We largely remained neutral and we took the path of non-interference, where we wouldn't interfere with Myanmar's internal issues. And parallelly, we cultivated very, very close relations with the military junta itself. Now, this is quite unique and surprising. For a democratic country to be siding with a military dictatorship that's abusing human rights, right? It's very unique and strange as well. The reason primarily why India took such a stand was driven by security considerations of India. Because Myanmar was critical, as we understood, to stabilize the northeast region, to tackle the threat of insurgency. China in particular was known to use Myanmar as a base to sponsor and support India's northeast insurgent outfits. To deal with the security threats, to secure the India-Myanmar border, which is a critical border for India, and to protect its core national interests, India was bound to have good relations with Myanmar's military junta. That's why since 1960s, when the military coup happened, India didn't criticize the military. Till date, in fact, we have never publicly criticized Myanmar's military junta. When the pro-democracy movement was crushed in 1980s and Aung San Suu Kyi was placed under house arrest, India didn't criticize Myanmar. Right? So that is the approach we took, which is basically a realpolitik approach. Realpolitik refers to the pursuit of a very realistic foreign policy, where you keep your idealism away. You stay away from the idealist school of thought and you follow a more realist approach in your foreign policy in order to protect your core national interests. Because India knew that we couldn't interfere in Myanmar's internal matters. There was nothing that India could do to curb the crisis within the country. So India realized that it's better to protect its core interests, as China was the most influential country in Myanmar. As Myanmar's military junta, the military leaders were under communist influence, Myanmar has always been extremely close to China. China has made big investments here, provided defense and weapons support. There was no way that India could compromise its interests by antagonizing the military leaders in Myanmar. So India ignored the considerations of human rights and democratic values and adopted a very realistic approach. We broke away from the Western countries, even bypassed the Western sanctions, and we became a very, very close partner for Myanmar. After China, India became one of the most influential countries in Myanmar. We invested in the country. As we discussed, we built the Sitwe port. We have taken up the Kaladan project. We have supplied weapons as well. We have given defense support to Myanmar. We actually have very close security ties with Myanmar. We have conducted joint exercises, we share intelligence, conduct joint operations as well. Recently, Indian Navy has leased a submarine. We have gifted a submarine to Myanmar as well. That is the close defense relations India has built despite what's happening inside Myanmar. So this situation continued until 2010. And finally, Myanmar's military leadership came under a lot of international pressure. The economic sanctions were hurting Myanmar's economy and the future prospects of the military leaders. So to finally open up Myanmar's economy and to exploit the resources of Myanmar, the military leaders paved the way for reforms, democratic reforms. In 2010, a partial democracy was introduced in order to please the Western countries and to get the sanctions lifted. All right? The military leaders, the military junta introduced partial democratic reforms, where elections were allowed, but the military leaders would retain most of the positions in the parliament. Most of the parliament seats were reserved for the military itself, where they would be nominated, not elected. Only few seats were thrown open for elections. This partial transition to democracy was not recognized by the Western countries. But however, India, China, and even Russia, which is a close friend of Myanmar, they all appreciated the changes that Myanmar was making. So this partially democratic government continued until 2015. And finally, under Western pressure, Myanmar transitioned into a democracy. The military junta stepped aside. The prime motivation here was to get the sanctions lifted because Western sanctions were crippling Myanmar's economy. So the military junta stepped aside in 2015 and introduced full-fledged democracy in the country. Full-fledged transparent elections took place where NLD, the National League for Democracy, won the elections under the leadership of Aung San Suu Kyi. Even though Aung San Suu Kyi couldn't become the president because of a constitutional change that military leaders had done, she still continued to guide the party and became a state councillor after the democratic government was formed. So for 5 years, from 2015 to 2020, Myanmar had transitioned into a democracy. Now this was a positive change for India. India welcomed the change. It was in India's interest because we no longer had to choose between Western countries and Myanmar. We no longer had to face pressure and criticism from Western countries for bypassing sanctions and maintaining good ties with Myanmar. India could freely engage with Myanmar because Western countries themselves lifted the sanctions after this transition in 2015. Western countries re-established their ties and started looking at making investments in Myanmar. So this opened up a competition essentially between China, Russia, the ASEAN regional powers, Western countries and India. All regional and global powers, they started competing for influence in Myanmar. Because now Myanmar had transitioned into a democracy and Western sanctions had been lifted. So this was seen as a huge breakthrough. But even under this democratic rule, there were large-scale human rights violations, particularly targeted against Rohingya Muslims. Large-scale violence was committed by Myanmar's army with the backing of few radical Buddhist outfits, which almost resulted in a genocide-like situation. The UN has called the Rohingyas as the world's most persecuted community. It triggered a massive refugee crisis in the region. But still the presence of democracy was good, not just for the region, but even for Indian interests. But all these gains have been erased. It has been wiped out in 2021 when Myanmar fell back under military rule. Because see, after the first term of NLD government expired in 2020, fresh elections were held and NLD was clearly winning the elections again. So it pointed to the increasing popularity of Aung San Suu Kyi, the increasing popularity of democracy and the NLD. The military leaders couldn't digest this and they nullified the election results and they declared a state of emergency in February 2021. Since then, the military has taken over the country again. It essentially staged a military coup again by nullifying the elections, by throwing out the democratic government and the political parties, and the military junta has captured power again in the country. So since the last 2 years, opposition parties, civilians, and various other local native groups as well, they have been protesting, they have been fighting for democracy. And Myanmar's military junta has crushed the protests by using massive force. Hundreds of civilians have been killed. Myanmar has even resorted to airstrikes, which is a disproportionate use of force against civilian protesters. All the opposition entities have come together, the political outfits, and they have formed a parallel government called National Unity Government. And today they are not just limited to a political opposition and peaceful protests, even they have taken up counter violence by setting up their own armed wing to counter the atrocities of Myanmar's military. The National Unity Government, which is a coalition of various political groups and resistance groups, they have aligned with ethnic militant outfits like the Chins. They have aligned with various ethnic militant groups. They've all come together to oppose the military rule, and they are engaging in counter violence as well. So this has given Myanmar's military junta the opportunity to use massive force. By blaming the opposition elements and the resistance forces, large-scale military operations are taking place, and in order to regain the lost territory, because some territories have been lost to opposition-controlled groups, so military junta has used airstrikes as an option, which is a clear disproportionate use of force. Recently, one of the airstrikes landed in India. It landed on the Indian side as well, raising concerns about India-Myanmar relations. So hundreds of civilians have been killed in such airstrikes. Recently, one such airstrike has happened. So this is where the editorial is expressing concern about the situation in Myanmar. It's escalating day by day, it's going out of hand, and it's not good news for the region and for the world. As long as India stays silent on the matter, it's going to derail our interests. Peace and stability is of utmost importance in the neighborhood to protect India's core national interests. And the situation in Myanmar currently is not conducive. As you can expect, Western countries have again cut off their ties. As soon as the emergency was imposed in 2021, Western countries cut off the ties again, criticized Myanmar, and they have reimposed the sanctions. That is the stand taken by the Western countries. Of course, they're not doing it just for the sake of democracy or human rights. They have their own vested interests. The vested interest of Western countries is that they would like to counter the influence of Russia and China, which are very, very close to Myanmar's military junta. It's geopolitical considerations which is driving the policy of Western countries. That's why India does not follow their sanctions. India never usually follows unilateral sanctions. Is that clear? So Russia and China are very, very close to the military junta. They have given complete support, including funds and weapons. In many ways, Russia and China have enabled Myanmar's military by supplying weapons and providing funds and giving diplomatic support as well at the United Nations. All right. Recently, Myanmar was blacklisted by the FATF. It has been placed along with Iran and North Korea, and it's been blacklisted. And Russia and China continue to bypass all these sanctions, and they continue to provide funds and weapons to Myanmar. So global powers aren't doing enough to curb the situation. Western countries, even though they have imposed sanctions, it's not out of genuine concern for the people. Their genuine concern is not democracy and human rights. Their genuine interest is geopolitical interests, to counter the influence of Russia and China, to exploit the resources of Myanmar. That is the interest of Western countries. In the middle of this, India has largely taken a neutral stand again. We have just urged for calm, peace to be restored, for talks to happen, but we till date have never criticized Myanmar's military for the atrocities they have committed. This is in line with the realpolitik policy of India. We have been following this from 1960s. We don't interfere in Myanmar's internal issues because Myanmar is critical. We would like to deal with whoever is in power to protect India's interests. It's a very realistic policy, a pragmatic policy, which overrides the idealistic concerns. Yes, there are concerns about democracy and human rights, but subsequent Indian governments have prioritized national interests, and hence we have largely taken a neutral stand in order to protect our core security interests in northeast of India. To protect the security interests in northeast region and to counter Chinese influence. Right? India has taken a very realistic position, and we have stayed away from excessive criticism of Myanmar's military. But the editorial says this position is not viable considering what's happening. Even the ASEAN group of countries have failed to work out a peace arrangement. ASEAN is a regional grouping of Southeast Asian countries, right? Myanmar is a part of it. So all major democracies in Southeast Asia, like Indonesia, Singapore and others, collectively through the ASEAN group, they had proposed a peace plan. A 5-point peace plan had been proposed. But the peace plan has failed, it has not worked. Myanmar's military has not respected the peace plan that was suggested by ASEAN. So both regional and global powers, they have failed, they have fallen short of putting pressure on Myanmar. Be it India, be it Western countries, Russia, China, and Southeast Asian countries. They've all been failing repeatedly from exerting that pressure on Myanmar, which has allowed military junta to continue its atrocities. So the editorial is striking a note of caution because destabilization here on this scale will affect the whole region. It will affect India and the whole region as well. That's why the editorial is urging for restoration of democracy. And this will not happen without international pressure. Regional powers and global powers together have to put that pressure in order to curb the large-scale human rights violations which are happening and to push the military to step down and to restore democracy in the country. So that is the stand the editorial is taking. All right. Now coming to the other articles, they're all relatively smaller articles. We have an article on page number 12 that's related to India-US relations, and it's also a topic from Science and Technology. It's related to the NISAR Satellite, which is a joint project between ISRO and NASA. The topic is relevant not just for prelims, even for your mains. According to this article, NISAR Satellite will be used to map the seismic zones of the Himalayan ranges. As you know, the Himalayan belt is seismically very active. It's a very seismically sensitive zone because you have the active tectonic movement taking place under the Himalayas. It's an active subduction zone where the Indian plate is constantly diving under the Eurasian plate. This tectonic movement keeps the whole region on the hook. It's a seismically very active zone where earthquakes are very common. It's very much possible to witness or experience high magnitude earthquakes, devastating earthquakes. This could trigger secondary disasters as well, like landslides or even land subsidence, as we saw recently at Joshimath in Uttarakhand. So Himalayas is a very sensitive zone and it's highly prone to disasters. So according to this article, the NISAR satellite, which is a very ambitious space project between ISRO and NASA, it is going to help India to deal with the seismic threats and the disasters in the Himalayan zone. So let's talk about this topic in more detail so that you can answer any prelims or even mains question based on this topic. India's ISRO and NASA of the US, they both launched a joint initiative a few years ago to develop a synthetic aperture radar satellite called NISAR. It stands for NASA ISRO. N stands for NASA, I for ISRO. SAR is the payload. SAR stands for synthetic aperture radar. That is the payload on this satellite. This is one of the most expensive satellite projects of India and as well as the US. It serves a very unique purpose because the payload it is carrying itself is unique. A synthetic aperture radar has unique capabilities. Any satellite equipped with synthetic aperture radar is an Earth observation satellite. The primary purpose is to observe the Earth. It's an Earth observation satellite. But the uniqueness about synthetic aperture radar is that it can provide very high resolution images even during night time. It can even penetrate cloud cover and forest cover to take high resolution pictures of the Earth. This is something which is not possible with your regular optical instruments. In a regular Earth observation satellite, the payload is optical. The lens which is used to capture the images, right? The instruments which are used are optical instruments. Optical instruments have a limitation. They don't function well during the night. Separate night imaging technology has to be added to it, or they don't see through cloud cover and dense forest cover, right? This is the limitation of Earth observation satellites which are relying on optical instruments. But synthetic aperture radar is a very advanced technology. You guys might have heard about the NISAR series of satellites, which was a joint project between India and Israel. This was our first synthetic aperture radar project where Israel helped India in the technology in developing synthetic aperture radars. These radars, they serve not just a civilian application, they actually have a very big military application as well. Since these radars can capture very high resolution pictures even during night time, and since they can penetrate cloud cover and vegetation cover, they are very useful for intelligence gathering, for reconnaissance, for border management, for monitoring the enemy troop positions, their deployments, to check infiltration, to tackle crime along the border areas. these satellites can be very crucial, which are equipped with synthetic aperture radar. So India already has experience with synthetic aperture radar under the NISAR series of satellites, which are dual application satellites. They do have civilian application, but it primarily serves a military application. So India and US have gotten together to launch a similar project called NISAR, which primarily has a civilian application. The payload here is synthetic aperture radar, which provides all-weather Earth observation capabilities. Through day and night, through any weather conditions, you can generate very high resolution pictures that serves many, many civilian applications. The uniqueness about NISAR satellite is that it is the first time where radar data from the synthetic aperture radar will be collected in two microwave bandwidth ranges, both in the L band and S band. In the L band, with a frequency of 1 to 2 gigahertz, which is often used for satellite communication and remote sensing, along with S band, which operates in the range of 2 to 4 gigahertz, which is often used for satellite communication and weather monitoring. Both the frequencies, both the bandwidths will be used in the NISAR satellite. It will collect radar data in both frequencies, thus providing for higher precision when it comes to Earth observation. All right? It will serve a critical purpose in remote sensing, in mapping out the Earth's surface with high resolution pictures and generating very accurate, reliable data that can serve multiple applications. You can monitor the land mass, you can monitor the ice glaciers, you can monitor the agricultural resources, and it will play a critical role in disaster management as well. These are some critical applications of the NISAR satellite, which is slated to be launched next year in 2024. The project actually has been delayed. It was supposed to be launched by now, but a launch date has been set for next year, 2024. And the satellite has been recently shipped to India. ISRO has received the initial payload from NASA. It will undergo further assembly in India before being launched next year. So the main application of NISAR is in disaster mapping. It will help in mapping out the disaster prone areas. The hazard vulnerability map can be clearly developed. It will help in disaster planning, in preparedness, and also in dealing with the disaster when it has already happened, in search and rescue operations as well. It will help in monitoring permafrost around the world. It will help in monitoring the ice caps, the glaciers, which are melting at an accelerated rate due to climate change. It will help in keeping a check on the forest cover and as well as the agricultural crops. It will help in better planning, efficient resource management, streamlining of services in agriculture sector, in forest management, etc. So it serves many, many applications, and one of the biggest application is to map out the seismically active Himalayan belt. Is that clear? It is going to map out the Himalayan belt with great regularity. The whole focus here is to identify the most active points with regard to major earthquakes and land subsidence. The idea is to prevent another Joshimath-like incident. So what the project is aiming to do is that ISRO and NASA, they will tie up with other related institutions like the National Geophysical Research Institute of India and the Geological Survey of India. The geoscientific community will play a critical role here in assessing the satellite data. So every 12 days, the satellite will be designed to pass in a sun-synchronous orbit with special focus on the Himalayan belt to generate a deformation map, to identify the potential areas of land subsidence in the Himalayas, to identify the seismic hotspots in the Himalayan belt. So every 12 days, the satellite will pass through the Himalayan belt, over the Himalayan belt, in a sun-synchronous orbit, capturing high-resolution pictures which will help geoscientists to develop a detailed deformation map of the Himalayan region. This will further help in identifying the seismic zones and identify the strain, thus pointing out the most vulnerable locations along the Himalayas. The Geological Survey of India has already carried out one similar exercise to develop a strain map of the Himalayan belt. This was brought out in 2021. This is based on GPS data collected from around 1,200 GPS points along the Himalayas. But this data is not enough. It's not dense enough. It's not of high resolution. It's not sufficient enough to map out the most vulnerable zones for landslides, land subsidence, and high intensity magnitude 8 earthquakes. So along with this strain map, if NISAR satellite helps in developing a deformation map, then this geological data will serve a critical purpose for planners and policy makers to take appropriate steps to manage disasters in the Himalayan belt. Currently, we have very limited resources to do this. Apart from this strain map developed by Geological Survey of India, we rely on the Sentinel satellite of European Space Agency, which is more expensive. The Sentinel satellite of European Space Agency has helped India keep an eye on the Himalayan belt, especially with regard to the seismic activities. But this is not a long-term option for India. So NISAR will help India to work with ISRO and other institutions. It will be a game changer in Earth observation as far as monitoring the seismic activities in the Himalayan belt is concerned. All right. So it serves multiple purposes as far as Earth observation is concerned and remote sensing is concerned. That is why NISAR is a major project, a space cooperation project between India and US. Now we move on to the prelims oriented topics. From page number 1, you have this article which refers to AIIMS, the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. Prime Minister Modi has inaugurated AIIMS Guwahati, which is the first AIIMS institution in the northeast of India. As you know, AIIMS is a leading medical institution in the country, right? The first one established during the days of Prime Minister Nehru, has played a critical role in the field of medical research and development. AIIMS is not just a medical college, not just a hospital, but it's a leading research, innovation and development center in the field of healthcare and medical research. So under the Vajpayee administration, there was a focused attempt to set up new AIIMS-like institutions around the country. And now under the Modi government, this is being further expanded. And we are looking at least 15 to 20 AIIMS around the country, which will become operational very soon. From Karnataka to Tamil Nadu to Northeast India to Central and Eastern India, all across the country, AIIMS-like institutions are coming up, right? The whole focus here is to promote medical research, medical education, and innovation in the field of healthcare. So with regard to Northeast India, it's a key initiative. It brings an elite leading research institution to the Northeast region, which is part of the ongoing stabilization and normalization in the Northeast region. All right, so that is an important point that you can take note of. Next, we have one more article on page number 5 related to art and culture, to an extent tied with science and technology as well. According to the article, the state government of Uttarakhand, along with the Union Health Ministry and other authorities, they are planning to use drones to provide life-saving drugs to pilgrims who might face any emergency conditions during the Char Dham Yatra in Uttarakhand. So that is the topic which is in news here. So this highlights 2 points. One, the role of drones in future delivery. How drones can revolutionize disaster management, healthcare, and service delivery, including e-commerce sector, food delivery, etc. The civilian application of drones is immense in the near future, right? So that is one point you can take away from here. And India is already putting this to use, because the Char Dham Yatra, or also called the Chota Char Dham Yatra in Uttarakhand, right? It's a very sacred pilgrimage for Hindus. And considering the adverse conditions present here, the high altitude conditions, the extreme low temperature, low oxygen conditions with the presence of snow and ice, creates several health challenges. All right, there are possibilities of respiratory challenges being faced by pilgrims, especially old pilgrims, those who are recovering from various comorbid conditions, including COVID-19, right? They all face respiratory challenges. Also, there are possibilities of hypothermia, possibilities of frostbite, right? Avalanches, landslides and floods. So every now and then pilgrims get caught in these incidents and hundreds of pilgrims lose their lives. Anywhere between 80 to 90 pilgrims die every year on an average. And recently the number has gone up. It has gone into 120, 140 range. Every year more than 100 pilgrims are losing their lives. So a lot of people face health emergencies during the pilgrimage. So it's important to reach out to them with medical assistance on time. That is why drones are being considered as a quick solution to dispatch life-saving drugs to these pilgrims. Now, from a prelims point of view, with regard to art and culture, there's a very important point you can take away from here. Which are the Char Dham sites in Uttarakhand? The Char Dham sites include Yamunotri, Kedarnath, Gangotri and Badrinath. These are the 4 important Hindu pilgrimage sites in Uttarakhand. It's also referred to as Chota Char Dham because there is another nationwide Char Dham Yatra. I'll show you that map as well. So these are the 4 Char Dham sites in Uttarakhand, and they're all, as you can see, present in and around the Ganga River basin along the banks of the Ganga River and its tributaries. They are very sacred pilgrimage sites in Hinduism, a very important pilgrimage. So the government is looking to improve tourist infrastructure along with providing the right medical facilities. That's why drones are being employed to provide life-saving medical assistance. Let me give you one more important point here, a geography-based point. These Char Dham sites, Yamunotri, Kedarnath, then Gangotri and Badrinath, they are located in the Garhwal Himalayan range. The Garhwal Himalayan range, you can find this in Uttarakhand. Alright? It's part of the Shivaliks. As you know, Shivaliks is the outermost Himalayan range, the lower ranges of the Himalayas that stretches from Himachal Pradesh to Uttarakhand. So as part of the Shivalik ranges in Garhwal Himalayas, this is where you find the Char Dham sites or the Chota Char Dham sites in Uttarakhand. The other Char Dham Yatra, the nationwide Char Dham Yatra, which is a much bigger pilgrimage, it includes 4 sacred Hindu pilgrimage sites. That is Badrinath Temple in Uttarakhand from the Chota Char Dham Yatra, the Jagannath Temple in Puri, Odisha, Ramnath Swami Temple in Rameshwaram in Tamil Nadu, and Dwarkadish Temple at Dwarka in Gujarat. These 4 are considered to be part of the Char Dham Yatra, whereas the 4 sites in Uttarakhand are seen as part of Chota Char Dham. Alright, so both the points are very important. Where they are located can be very, very important for your prelims from an art and culture point of view. Next, moving on, there is a very important article related to India's relations with Armenia. Armenia's ambassador to India has expressed a lot of hope that India-Armenia relations are improving day by day. He has even said that one day a strategic partnership will develop between India and Armenia. So let's look at this topic in slight detail, especially from a prelims point of view, but trust me, the points will be relevant for your mains as well. Let me show you the map of Armenia. Many of you may not know where exactly Armenia is located. See, Armenia is a country which is sandwiched between Turkey, Georgia, Azerbaijan and Iran. It's in this region that Armenia is located. It's part of the South Caucasus region. It's part of the South Caucasus region of Eurasia, Central Asia region. Alright? South Caucasus is the extension of southern part of Russia. This is where you have Georgia, and below that you have Armenia and Azerbaijan, which is bound on the other side by Turkey, Iran, etc. So Armenia has a historical link with India, an age-old connection. Even during ancient times, there are trade linkages which can be proven through documented evidence. Indian traders had a presence in Armenia since ancient times. Armenian goods were being traded in Indian market. Armenian traders used to come to India. There are documented evidence to show the presence of Armenian merchants during the Mughal Empire in India. There is a strong Armenian community settled in Kolkata even today. So there's a very strong cultural bond that exists right from ancient times to colonial period, and Armenia becomes a close partner for India in the region. Alright? We have very important interests here. Armenia was part of the Soviet Union during the Cold War period. Obviously, India had excellent relations with the Soviet Union. And after Soviet Union collapsed and disintegrated in 1991, Armenia became an independent country, and India was one of the first countries to establish ties with Armenia. We recognized Armenia's independence, set up close diplomatic relations, and it was one of the few members of the Commonwealth of Independent States with whom India had set up ties apart from Russia. Alright? So Armenia, if you look at it from a social point of view, it's largely a Christian country. whereas its neighbor that you see here, Azerbaijan, is a Muslim nation. There has been an ongoing conflict as well between the two. That's why I'm raising this point. While Armenia is largely a Christian nation, Azerbaijan is largely a Muslim nation, there is a territorial dispute going on between them from quite some time. This is called the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. The conflict had recently escalated, turned into a brief war as well between the two countries. In Nagorno-Karabakh region, in the Nagorno-Karabakh region here, it's essentially like an Armenian enclave. You find Armenian population here, Christian population essentially, but the territory actually belongs to Azerbaijan. The territorial control actually is claimed by Azerbaijan, but the region is with a strong Armenian population. This is a relic of the Cold War era, when Soviet Union disintegrated and these new countries were born, right? The haphazard divisions which happened gave rise to this problem, this complex problem, where you have Armenian population trapped in Azerbaijan's territory. It's like an Armenian exclave. So both countries have claimed the territory and they have a long-standing conflict going on over this. In the last 2-3 years, this conflict has escalated. Now, India has very good ties with Armenia. We have quite decent relations with Azerbaijan. So for India, it's about balancing the two. With regard to Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, India has largely taken a neutral position. All right? But however, when it comes to defense and strategic ties, India is getting very, very close to Armenia. Let me just point out some examples here. Armenia has increased its defense exports from India. That is, it's importing defense equipment from India. India has stepped up its defense exports to Armenia. Since Armenia is looking to strengthen its military position against Azerbaijan, it has procured the Swati weapons locating radar built indigenously by Bharat Electronics Limited from India. Armenian military has procured this from India. Recently, it has signed a contract for Pinaka multi-barrel rocket system, which is an indigenous short-range rocket system. It's a multi-launch, multi-barrel rocket system developed by DRDO. It can fire short-range rockets in the range of 40 to 90 kilometers. It's already inducted by the Indian Army. So Armenia has signed a contract to procure the Pinaka rocket system. It's also looking to procure man-portable anti-tank guided missiles from India, which has been indigenously developed by India. So very close defense relations are coming up. Armenia is becoming a defense export market for India's defense industry. That's why strategic relations are building up. Both sides are considering to appoint a defense attaché at each other's embassies. As the defense trade is improving, right? Both countries are considering to place a defense attaché at their embassies to take forward the defense relationship. All right? So that is why Armenian ambassador feels that this could become a strategic partnership in the coming days. However, we have very close ties with Azerbaijan as well. That is something we can't compromise. Azerbaijan is quite close to Russia, and India has some important projects that has been proposed that includes Azerbaijan. However, one problem here is that Azerbaijan often supports Pakistan over the Kashmir issue, whereas Armenia completely backs India over the Kashmir conflict. So all these complex factors push India to take this position on the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. All right? But Armenia is also very important, especially if you look at the connectivity projects here in this region. India has a lot of stakes. There are some key connectivity projects like INSTC project, which aims to create a shorter route between India and Russia. The traditional shipping route between India and Russia is through the Arabian Sea and Gulf of Aden and Bab el-Mandeb Strait. You can see here the traditional shipping route through Red Sea, Suez Canal, Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic. This traditional route from India to Russia is a very long circuitous route. It's time consuming, more expensive. Hence, they are planning a shorter route for many years that includes Iran and Azerbaijan. This is Caspian Sea that you see here. Through Caspian Sea, through Bandar Abbas port of Iran, present near Persian Gulf, India plans to connect with Iran and further with Caspian Sea, where Azerbaijan has an inland navigation network, and further take the goods directly into Russia. So Azerbaijan is crucial for INSTC project. Similarly, Armenia is also crucial. Armenia can play a critical role in linking Black Sea and Caspian Sea with the Persian Gulf. Armenia is very important for this connectivity to link the Persian Gulf, which is crucial for oil supplies, with Black Sea, crucial for grain supplies, with the Caspian Sea that could link us with Russia, right? So India has conflicting interests with both the sides here, and even though we are more close to Armenia than Azerbaijan, mainly due to the Kashmir issue and the stand Azerbaijan takes on it, we take a neutral stand on the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. But we are increasing defense supplies to Armenia, which is strengthening Armenia's military position against Azerbaijan. So that is the complex equation here. You should be familiar with these basic aspects. You can expect a prelims or mains question on this topic. Now coming to the last topic from page number 11, again from international relations. India has held a joint working group on the operationalization and usage of Chabahar Port in Iran. This meeting took place between India, several Central Asian countries and Iran. Ministers from India, few Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan and Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, and Iran. These countries have met to hold a joint working group discussion on the utilization of Chabahar Port project, which is an Indian project in Iran. Is that clear? Parallelly, China had its own meeting with Afghanistan, mainly with the Taliban and others, where China has promised support to the Taliban government through the Belt and Road Initiative. China has promised to enhance connectivity for Afghanistan through its Belt and Road Initiative. But the real interesting point here is that Taliban has recently expressed a positive view about the Chabahar Port of India in Iran. As Taliban is opening up to India and India also has opened up to Taliban, there are possibilities of India-Afghan collaboration to again reactivate the Chabahar Port in Iran to connect with Afghanistan and Central Asia. Chabahar Port here, which you can see in the map, it's located in Iran between Persian Gulf on one side and Gulf of Oman on the other side. It's present near the strategic Hormuz Strait, the Strait of Hormuz, which is crucial for global oil supplies. At this critical location, India has built a strategic port in Iran, and we were looking at this as an alternate route to access Afghanistan by bypassing Pakistan. As India does not have direct land connectivity with Afghanistan, with the Wakhan corridor here, because Pakistan has illegally captured these territories in Jammu and Kashmir, right? Gilgit-Baltistan is under the illegal occupation of Pakistan. If India had access to Gilgit-Baltistan, we would have direct access to Wakhan corridor, which would connect us with Afghanistan and then with Central Asia. But the lack of connectivity has become a hurdle for India to trade with Afghanistan and Central Asian countries. They are blessed with great resources, but we are not able to exploit them due to lack of connectivity. So one of the ambitious strategic projects of India has been to work with Iran to build a strategic Chabahar port. So through the Chabahar railway line and road project, we can connect with the Zaranj-Dilaram road in Afghanistan, which has been built by India. The Zaranj-Dilaram road has already been built by India when we had a friendly civilian government in Afghanistan. These projects have been threatened by the Taliban takeover, plus India-Iran relations have been affected as well, as India has followed American sanctions against Iran. So the relative importance of Chabahar port has declined because Iran cancelled the Chabahar railway project that involved India. As India-Iran relations were affected, Iran dropped India out of the Chabahar railway project. But still, the Chabahar port remains active. An Indian company still operates the terminal at Chabahar port, and we have a new initiative with Central Asian countries. Last year, there was an India-Central Asia summit that happened, which set up a joint working group. This brings India with Central Asian countries along with Iran together to talk about the operationalization and utilization of Chabahar port. This will boost opportunities for all the countries involved, along with bringing development opportunities for Afghanistan. Even the Taliban, which currently rules Afghanistan, is aware of this. That is why Taliban has expressed a positive view about the Chabahar port involving India. All right. This also shows the competition here between India and China, as China is offering an alternative through the Belt and Road Initiative. Understood? So that is the key development here, and you should know where Chabahar port is located, why it is strategically vital for India. On this note, I would bring my discussion to an end. I've given a couple of mains practice questions. These are based on what we discussed under the detailed analysis. So please write an answer to the question, post it in the answer writing portal. All right, and don't forget to head to the Telegram channel now, because we'll have a quiz on some of these topics so you can revise these topics again. I hope it was a good, fruitful session. I hope you liked it. Do let us know by pressing that like button, share your comments, and do subscribe to the channel. That's it from my side. I'll see you tomorrow. Take care.